Hi friends, I'm Jeffy G, and I'm back in the studio doing a review of a much underrated, unappreciated Roland sound module called the SonicCell. I've borrowed this from a friend. Now the thing about this device is it has many functions and it's quite unique. It's kind of like a middle child with all those psychological issues that go along with it. You see, was it designed for a live gig? Was it designed to be used in a studio with a computer? And is it relevant today? Let's take a look. The interesting and unique thing about the Roland SonicCell is that it's really three devices in one. It's a sound module, it's an audio interface, and it's a music file player. And tackling these things in reverse order, I could not get the music file player to work for several reasons. First of all, the USB storage device, I believe, has to be formatted in a certain way, and I could not find any information online on what that format is. So although I stored MP3, WAV, and Midi files on a USB storage device and tried it, every time I plugged it into the SonicCell and fired it up, it just hung and got stuck. Originally, Roland used to deliver an editor that worked for the file player. It allowed you to create playlists and arrange files, and it would only store up to 99 song files. That editor software no longer works on any Mac or Windows computer, so in my mind, the file player is pretty much useless now. The audio interface works fine, but it is a single input audio interface with very limited functionality. The input level control is on the back of the device, and quite frankly, there's just so many better audio interfaces out there these days. I can't see anybody actually using this. So that's kind of off the table too. And that leaves the most functionality around the sound module itself. And so for the rest of this video, we're going to concentrate our discussion on that. There are more popular sound modules from Roland. The JV1080 is a good example. It was by far more popular. You might consider it to be, the older brother or older sister. Let's take a look at the technical specs. It's often easiest to compare this with its much more popular sibling, the Roland JV1080. The SonicCell has 128 voice polyphony, 896 patches, and 32 rhythm sets, and 64 performances. It is 16-part multi-timbral, so you can have 16 parts all playing at the same time. And there are 78 effects types that are really built around about 20 different effects. It was released in 2007. They continued to sell it until 2012. You can pick them up used these days for anywhere from $300 to $400, depending on whether it has an expansion board in it or not. In the case of the JV1080, only 64 voices, a lot less notes, 640 patches, and 8 rhythm sets. More performances, 128, the same 16-part multi-timbral engine, the same effects types. It was released in '94 and was sold until 2001. You can pick these up for anywhere from $150 to $400 used. It really depends on how many expansion boards are included. Now when I first got the SonicCell into my studio, I had to hook it up. And it's pretty easy to hook up. There are some good diagrams in the manual if you've never done something like this before, but it's basic. You set up the Midi cables to the in and out ports. Those are standard Midi 5-pin connectors. And on the other side, you connect them to either your audio interface or a Midi port, multi-port device that might be connected to your computer via USB. You'll also have to connect the audio cable, the left and the right, out to your audio interface so that you can hear the results from the SonicCell being played back. A good way to test that all the cables are working is to put the SonicCell into its demo play mode. There's a few songs in there. I think if you press the 2 buttons for the file player at the same time, it'll bring up the demo mode. Once it's in play, you should be able to hear the audio. If you can't hear the audio, then you know something isn't hooked up correctly. There's also a small LED on the front of the SonicCell that tells you it's receiving Midi data. And one more word of advice is that the SonicCell might start up in either patch mode or performance mode. You need performance mode in order to play multiple parts. So if you want drums, bass, keyboards, all these different parts on all those 16 channels, it has to be in performance mode. The one that I got defaulted to patch mode, and I had to go into the settings to change it so that every time you start up the SonicCell, it starts up in performance mode. Whenever I get a new sound module or any external synth, and I want to use it in Logic or MainStage, the first thing I do is I go out to the internet and get a manual. And that's what I've done here. I've got the Roland SonicCell manual. And what I'm after is really details around the Midi implementation. Skip down to this page in one of the appendices. You'll see this section up here that has bank, select, and program numbers. Because eventually I'm going to want to use Logic to control the programs that I select from the many banks that are offered. The other thing I'll take a look at is the list of patches. So in this case, you'll see there's a user group of patches, and then you've got preset group A, B, C. It goes on for quite a while. You know, keep in mind that this device has 896 preset patches built over, more than 1,000 waveforms. Having all those patch titles and everything in a PDF isn't going to help me very much. I essentially want to put it into a spreadsheet, so I'm going to be able to manipulate those things. So here's what the spreadsheet looks like. I've just basically pasted stuff from the PDF into a spreadsheet, and I've created a separate tab for each one of the banks, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then in the manual, I found that the CC numbers for controlling the bank and patch information were easy to find, and I just created a summary here. So for example, I know that preset A group is CC0 equal to 87 and CC32 equal to 64. And you can see it just increments up 65, 66, all the way to preset group G. And what's it like to cut and paste? Well, it's a little bit tedious. You go to the PDF, 257. I'm gonna just highlight some of these, copy, go over to my Excel spreadsheet, add another sheet, might increase the width of the cell, and I'm just gonna paste those in here, increase the size so I can read it. And then I've got all of my patch names and reference numbers in some usable format. Just to give you an idea of where we're going with this, I've got a Logic project open. I started with an empty project. And if you click on the Option button and go under Window, you can open the Midi environment. That menu item only appears if you hold down the Option button. It used to always be there in older versions of Logic. Now you got to hold down Option. And the layer you're interested in is the Midi instrument layer. I have a Midi instrument called SonicCell. I created that by going New, Multi-Instrument. So I'm just trying to show you where we're going with this thing. And if I open up that instrument by double-clicking on it, you'll see all the patch names for all the various banks. This is going to give me access to all 896 patches, plus I think I put the rhythm kits in there as well. Yeah. Now, in order for Logic to send the CC messages to change those bank and program attributes, you need to go into Options, Define Custom Messages. It's an important step that I wasn't too familiar with before, but necessary depending on what kind of synth you have. And in there is where you're going to enter in the bank control information. Remember, I needed CC0 to be 87 and CC32 to be 65. These are the MSB and LSB attributes. I've got a piano up here. I can see all of the preset titles for that bank, and I can pick one. And you can see down here, I've got all the banks available as well. So I can choose a different bank if I want to get access to one of the higher level presets, like say pipe organ. Of course, then when I play, change the preset automatically without touching the SonicCell. All right, let me walk you through that entire process. So I'm in Logic, I'm going to create a new project. I'm just going to create one audio track so there's something in this new project. Option, Window. I'm going to open up the Midi environment. And in the Midi environment, I'm going to go to the Midi instrument layer and create a new multi-timbral instrument, which is called a multi-instrument. And for labeling purposes, I'm just going to call this Roland Sonic. And you'll see there's a bunch of patch names in here, but these are just from some old instrument that I've set up. So what I want to do is change this to a custom message bank. I'm not going to use the general Midi settings for drums, but this is just for the purpose of naming it. Now, under Options, I'm going to select Define Custom Bank Messages. And it brings up this little table here. Remember, I mentioned to you that by reading the manual, I was able to extract some key information. Let's take a look at that again. Here it is. These were the details for the bank and program select numbers. The way to read this is that in order to select a bank, I need CC0 set to 87, CC32 set to 0, and then the program numbers 1 through 128 are going to give me my user patches. That applies to all of the preset banks. So to modify this, you really just double click. So for example, bank 1, I'm going to want that value. CC0 has got to be 87. So I'm going to make this CC0. It's going to have a value of 87. And still with bank 1, I've got, you see that changed on me? I'll have to go change it back. CC32, whoops, 32 is going to have a value of 64. And remember, this one needs to be 87. Okay, so what's going to happen is every time I make a change within Logic, it's going to send these two CC control messages, and that's going to give me the preset group A. Okay, and you can imagine you could set this up with as many banks as you want, repeating this process, bank 1 through bank 7. The next step is to paste in those preset titles, and that can be a two-step process. Keep in mind that your bank messages have to be set to custom bank messages, but I want to replace all of these titles with the text that was in my spreadsheet. Here's what I do. I go to my spreadsheet, I get preset bank A. I'm going to copy all of these, the first 128 text labels for the presets. Control C. And I'm going to use a third-party editor, because if I try to paste those directly in, well, let me show you what happens. So I go back into Logic. If I go under Options, Paste All Names, you see it creates spaces in between each name. And the reason it's doing that is that Excel adds a carriage return and line feed to every row. So I need to get rid of the carriage return and line feed. To do that, I'm using a third-party editor called Cot Editor, and you can get this for free. You can use a different editor, anything that will remove the carriage return line feeds. I paste in all the titles, the names, and then I copy and paste it out of the editor. It seems like a silly step, but I'll show you the results. I go back into Logic, and if I paste these names, boom, everything lines up nicely for me. Then for the next bank, I would choose bank number 1. It'll ask you if you want to initialize those. And again, I would go back to my Excel spreadsheet, get the list for preset B, copy those over to my editor, paste them into my editor, and then cut and paste them out of the editor into Logic. Over to Logic, and Option, Paste All Names. Boom. There, I got all my names in there. That's a lot of cutting and pasting, but it's way faster than typing in all the names. Just a couple more things to be aware of. Back into the environment, you want to make this multi-instrument assignable by clicking on that assignable link. And that's going to allow you to pick and choose the bank and patches from within the arranger window. Okay, and there may be other things that you want to configure here, like the Midi in and Midi out ports. In my case, I have a device called an MT4, which is a multi-MIDI port, and I've got the SonicCell plugged into port 1, and I can send all MIDI channels or just one. If I click on this program information, I'm able to choose any of those presets and any of the banks that I've set up so far. So that's the basic technique of creating a custom MIDI instrument within Logic for an external synth or module like the SonicCell. You would use this same technique regardless of what synth and vendor you're using. You just have to look at their user manual and find their MIDI implementation. When the SonicCell was released in 2007, sampling was starting to take over a lot of the keyboards that were out there. In fact, the next generation of keyboards after this Fantom series were ROMplers prefixed with XP. And if you're interested in that, I've got a video on my Roland XP30, which you can see linked above and down in the description. The advantage of the ROMplers is that rather than a synth engine, they are combined wavetable and samples. And so those sounds are a bit different, a bit more in the evolution of Roland's product line. Programming synthesis on the SonicCell can be a bit of a challenge. And that's because it's got a small LCD display and you have to navigate through the menus quite extensively. It has a jog wheel to make that a little bit easier, but it's kind of tedious, just as it is on all modules or rack modules. They typically don't have much space for the display. So if you're serious about it, you're going to need some kind of editor that you can use on your computer, both to manage the library of presets, your performances, and to do any custom programming. For that, there's a third-party product called Patchbase. It's pretty good. I haven't tried it out myself, but I hear good things about it. And they license editors for many different synths, not just Roland's, but from many different vendors. And you can buy their services on a subscription. If you're into sound design, I think that's the way I would go. Once you have the SonicCell set up and you start working your way through the patches, they're pretty good. I think you'll find that there's a lot of people out there that like the sound of these sound modules. Some of them are vintage. This one really isn't old enough to be considered vintage, I suppose. One of the reasons they sound good is the wavetables support more than 1,000 different wavetables. They start with individual tones, and each patch is made up of 4 different tones. So they can sound very full and thick. Add to that these 78 effects types, and Roland's gone a long way to make them sound extraordinary. But there are 2 camps on that theory. One camp likes external synths and sound modules. The other camp is pretty convinced that VSTs and alternative virtual instruments are just as good, if not better. Now, my goal making this video was to show you how you could use the SonicCell in Logic and in MainStage. I think I've done a reasonable job of explaining those details to you. And they are the same steps you would go through for any external synth that you use in Logic. If this is the kind of content that's helpful to you and you want more, click on the like button, leave me a comment with your opinion, subscribe to the channel, and click on the notification bell. That way when I release a new video, you'll get notified that it's available. Thanks for watching. I'm Jeffy G.